Hey, what's up, you guys? Welcome to Word First Radio, the podcast brought to you by Word First Ministries. I'm your host, Jacob O'Neill, and as always, I'm joined by my friend Cameron.
Hello.
And Cameron,
What up?
how are you doing?
I'm good.
Yep.
I'm well. It's become fall in Oslo. Mm-hmm. It's gotten cold and rainy and dark. It kind of happened all at once. Mm-hmm. But, those are sort of uncommon to our California experience.
That's right.
It's nice. It's nice to experience seasons. So.
You know, it was funny. I visited California a couple months ago, and it was... first of all, California in April now is too hot for me now.
Yeah.
It's very hot. And I was trying to take a nap in the middle of the day. I have no idea why. Mm-hmm. And I was just like, why is it? My goodness, it's so hot in here. I'm like, I couldn't believe it. And anyways, so my body is definitely acclimated to Norway.
We're in October. My mom told me yesterday, it's going to be 90 degrees today. I was like, oh, not here.
And the inverse of that, a funny inverse of that is I was talking to my dad, and my dad was like, yeah, man, it's been raining for like 3 days straight here. And I'm like, yeah, that sounds terrible. Could you imagine?
Oh my gosh. I walked Taya, my youngest daughter, we walk her to Barnehage to kindergarten every day.
Yep.
And it's like a half a mile walk. So it's nice. She and I just take a nice little stroll. And she's just in like the thin little pants and her dress. And it was cold out. It was maybe middle or high 30s. It's chilly. And she's just happy as can be. I'm like, aren't you cold? She's like, no, I'm not cold. You're just fine. So
yeah, it is a nice walk. And that's awesome.
So we're good. So all that, good.
Wonderful. And but we're not here to talk about that. We need to talk about something serious now.
Okay.
So we're going to talk about secularism.
Yeah. Okay.
And so secularism is kind of I don't know. Growing up, it's kind of a dirty word. It's kind of a bad word.
Yeah. I hate ism.
Sure.
Just as a thing, because it makes us like draw these hard boundaries and whatever. But I think I know.
There are really only a few isms really these days I'm comfortable labeling myself as, like Christianism for sure.
Yeah.
So anyway, secularism, it's kind of a bad word in like Christian circles. Not that they don't talk about it, but it has a lot of negative connotations for some people. And for other people, more secular people, maybe it has maybe positive, forward-thinking, neutral connotations. And so this is a topic that we've been talking about on our Skeptics evenings, and it's one that Cameron and I are passionate about and have thought a lot about. But let's just get started. What did you want to say? Because you reacted
that was
to
interesting. We were talking to Yaningva about that, and he's like, no, when I was in school, we learned about secularization of the culture, or whatever, and what that meant was detangling the state and the church. Because until very recently, I think it was 2012, I might be wrong about that, but it was very recently, the Church of Norway was the official religion of Norway. I mean, since like 932 AD. So for over 1,000 years, like 1,100 years, it was the official religion of the state. And but with secularism and secularization came, sort of divorcing or untying the people's religion from the people's government. And that was fascinating to me because that would mean, based on that conception of secularization or secularism or whatever, that mean that Norway, that has a Church of Norway, and most people are members of the Church of Norway, and the church, like, they advertise when it comes time to elect new people, just like political elections, and it's a huge part of the culture.
Right.
But Norwegian people are, in my opinion, way more secular. They don't believe in God. God doesn't really, even the concept of God doesn't touch their lives in a conscious way at all. And then America, who has never had a Church of the United States, and we famously have a wall of separation between the church and the state, are much less secular and much more religious. So anyways, that was just an interesting thing. We talked about secularization to a Norwegian person. He's like, oh yeah, well that just means when we separated church and state, which we have now.
Well, it demonstrates that the term, kind of means different things in different contexts, if you will. So there's a more political term for secularization, separation of church and state. And then there's a more sociological term or sociological connotation that has kind of been adopted by society, where we're like, okay, well, secularization is just pulling religion apart from any aspects of life. We pull religion apart from the sciences. We pull religion apart from our conception of like, you know, how we go about living our life and things like that.
It's like I've rid my life and way of thinking from superstition.
Yeah, absolutely.
Something like that.
So
we become scientific at the same rate that we've secularized. Like that's what it means, is we've gotten rid of these old supernatural superstitions, and they've been replaced with a scientific, enlightened, rational, modern worldview.
Yeah. So the term is a little slippery. I think it is. Because I mean, what's interesting is like, for people who have a theological heritage in the Baptist tradition, you could say that like maybe they were secular in a way. Because I mean, separation of church and state is one of those Baptist distinctives in the early days of the Baptist tradition. It was one of the things they were persecuted for, is that they wanted to separate the church from the state. They believed that they should be separate. And so,
as we've been talking about it in Skeptics Evening and Skeptics Club, what we mean is when we talk to non-believers here in Norway and we ask them to describe their worldview, how they go about thinking about things, why religion isn't a part of their like daily calculus for anything. Like, does religion, does belief in God, does that have anything to do with how you live your life? Like, well, no, I'm secular. Okay, well, tell me what that means. And that's, I think, what we're getting at is the people, the college students, the non-Christian people that we speak to in Norway. It's like, okay, well, that point of view that says science and reason are very important, and we've gotten rid of these sort of pre-rational vestiges of human society. And so what we take as as unbiased and as neutral as possible approach to viewing the world. And that's what we mean when we say secularism. Again, ism is frustrating because we don't want to draw tight definitions, but it's that impulse that says, no, what we need is a value neutral, unbiased way of processing the world and getting information and truth and knowledge.
Yeah, absolutely.
And religion isn't part of that. That is a biased, non-neutral. Yeah, I think that's a great definition. I want to echo 100%. That's exactly what I think of when I think of secularism too, and it's what we encounter constantly out here in Norway. And that's what we'll mean as we proceed. Yeah.
So I mean, I guess the question I want to ask is like, what's wrong with that? So is it? I guess we could start maybe with this idea of neutrality, if that's where you wanted to start.
Sure.
But so is that a neutral stance? Because I could say, if I wanted to play advocate, if I wanted to be secular, here, watch. So I'm secular now. I wanted to say like, well, listen, like I only believe things based off the evidence.
Yeah.
And I'm not going to adopt religious or superstitious thinking into my worldview until you've sufficiently convinced me that that's the case with evidence.
Yeah.
That sounds pretty neutral to me. What is
it? Does it does sound neutral? So I want to say my thinking is heavily influenced by the moderns, and some Christians don't like that, but I like them. I like the moderns a lot, and the way that they think and reason makes a lot of sense with me. I don't think it's perfect, but that impulse that's like, well, listen, I'm going to believe things that are good to believe, and how do I know if it's good to believe? Well, it has something to do with evidentiary support. You know, it matches other features we see about the world. And so so if you tell me something is true, then I should see other true things in the world that count as evidence for that thing, right? If someone says this thing is true, but there's no corresponding other truths, right, in the world, then and so that's what we mean by evidence. I mean, won't get into sort of the philosophical, because it's just too many words. But what we mean by evidence is like, you're making a claim. There should be observations that are true, that would be expected if that claim was true. And I like that way of thinking, that approach. It's like, well, especially when it comes to really important things, I need some evidence, and you're going to have to prove those things to me to some standard. I'm not just going to believe everything that everybody tells me, because then you're like because then you get blown around, right? Like a thing that gets blown around.
Yeah.
So that impulse is okay, but that's usually not all that people say. Like there's a whole lot that gets packed into that. You go, okay, so we should prove things to you. Let's talk about an argument. It's like, well, no, I don't want an argument. I want a demonstration. And you say, what's a demonstration? I couldn't tell you what a demonstration is, but you're going to have to do better. Yeah. Usually what comes associated with or attached to the thing you said, right? Which is I'll believe things once there's enough evidence, is a limitation to a certain kind of evidence. So generally it's highly scientistic, which is that the only valid way of knowing things is through something like a scientific method or process. So that it limits you to empirical detection. And a worldview that disbelieves, not a worldview, that's not fair, but at least a method, something they call it methodological naturalism, a method that says we're just going to find any explanation apart from a supernatural explanation. Any natural explanation is preferable to a supernatural one. And so we throw the supernatural ones in the trash. We don't even consider them, and we're going to keep looking for a natural one, even if, forgive me, I'll put on my Christian hat for a moment, even if all of the evidence implies a supernatural explanation. It's like, well, no, but that's supernatural, so we're not going to consider that. We're going to still keep looking for natural things, like looking for your wallet after you found it, right? It's like, well, any explanation except that I put it in this drawer, and you open the drawer and there it is, and you're like, okay, well, I've already said that's not an explanation. So I've said too many things. But what comes along with the very rational, evidence-based, I'll believe it when you prove it, are several assumptions. One of them is that is unbiased.
Exactly.
And that just isn't true. That's like, I don't know, it's a fish swimming in the ocean saying, listen, I'm not going to be swimming in anything. So from where I'm floating now, I'm surrounded by nothing. And it's like, well, no, you're not. You're still swimming. You're still surrounded by ocean and water. Maybe you're thinking about it a little bit more or whatever. But it's the thing that it's the claim, or at least the implicit claim, that what they're adopting is a neutral, unbiased position that doesn't have its own self-evident assumptions about the world. And you go, let's talk about those self-evident assumptions.
Well, because I mean, that in itself, exactly just what I presented, you can just rewind the video and just hear it again, what I just said. I mean, that is not, that itself has a whole list of assumptions with it, right? Because that statement itself, and it sounds pedantic and obstinate and stubborn and rude, because you don't just want to ask, you don't just want to stop the conversation by asking, how do you know 800 times?
Right.
But how do you know that statement, you have assumptions and biases in that statement itself. Like, I only believe the things that you can prove to me, and I'm not going to accept anything that isn't proved to me. And I'm going to make one exception, which is just that statement I just made, even though it wasn't proven to me. I'm just going to accept that anyways.
Yeah, right. So how do you know that's a good and rational and reasonable way of getting through the world? Right.
And the answer is, I think, perfectly reasonable, because let me give the answer first. The answer is, well, I mean, I've used it in the past. I've assumed it in the past, and it seems to have worked. I've looked at evidence, I've considered it, and I've changed my beliefs accordingly to align with the evidence. And I start with assumptions, and I look at the evidence, and I make it, an inference, like, okay, well, I mean, this is probably going to work. And I'm like, okay, well, if you can do it with that, like, you can do that with other things too. Yeah. Like, you don't have to, it's not a totally neutral stance is what I'm saying. And
of course it's not.
Nobody starts with a neutral stance. And so if I could start with, like, God, for instance. So if I grew up in a Christian home, and someone's like, well, how do you know this God stuff exists? And if you want to know if this God stuff exists, you have to stop believing in God first. Yeah. And then you can do an honest assessment of the evidence. Right. And I'm like, that's just not really how anything works. Yeah. You can start with God, and you can look at the world around you, and you can construct arguments and say, like, okay, well, what would be, if God does exist, what kind of features would we see in the world? If you can't start with the position, well, God doesn't exist, so now let's go look into the world and see if we can find evidence that he exists. Yeah. I guess you could start there, but you're obviously not neutral for starting there, first of all. You're obviously not unbiased for starting there. Just like, I'm not saying the Christian who grew up in a Christian home and is thinking about arguments for God's existence, I'm not saying that they're unbiased either or neutral. Right. But I mean, there's not... to find this middle ground, this neutral stance on anything when looking for the truth of something is so... Now I'm the one talking for too long, but it's just so... It's okay. You said it yourself. That's just so unachievable. Like, it seems like such a high bar to find a totally neutral stance.
Well, and the idea that what's neutral is no beliefs until they're proven scientifically.
Right.
You go, whoa, hang on. Like, I want to say time out to that, because science is a very new human invention. I mean, yeah, I'll just say that. Science is a very new thing on the human scene. It's like, well, okay, was everyone before that irrational? Or how do what you're doing is you're saying, what's an analogy? It's like you have a net. And you say, I'm going to believe everything I catch in this net.
Right.
But then presuming that everything that is not caught by your net is unknowable, unimportant, or whatever. And I want to go, no. You're just choosing a certain tool for capturing knowledge or information.
Yeah.
But then presuming that everything that is not detected or captured by that tool is irrelevant or useless or something like that. No, that's a huge presupposition. I mean, that's a major bias and a huge presupposition that the way that I get knowledge into me is by catching it with a science net.
Yeah.
And science is amazing. It's fantastic. I love it. I'm very glad that it has been invented and that we live in this day and age. But as a worldview, to say that I'll believe what's proven to me, and the way I prove it is by catching it with my science net, that's to let a whole lot of stuff. Like there's a whole lot of stuff through that you don't ever get to know or have into your mind, and is not captured by that net. Which, okay, if you say this is going to be the tool that I use, I've got one tool and I'm going to use it. That's fine, but you can't also claim that is a value neutral or unbiased position. Right. And I think there's this problem where I think there's a significant problem for people who adopt a worldview that is high bias and they have low bias awareness, which is that they become gullible in one direction. So I recently heard Mike Winger talking about this, and I think he's exactly right. So there are things we hear from people, and seems like exclusively from people who would call themselves secular. And things like, we know that the Bible was written hundreds of years after it was written. And you go, well, no, it wasn't. Let's look at the evidence. And there's this resistance to the actual evidence. Right. And I feel like very often when we talk with unbelievers, they have this whole backpack of falsehoods when it comes to religious investigation.
Sure.
And I feel like I must sound like the crazy one, because all the stuff that they assume is true about the world, I'm going, well, no, that's false, that's false, that's false, that's false, that's false. And if somebody did that to me about my worldview and said, actually, you've just been miseducated about everything, I'd be very suspicious of that person. Yeah. But nevertheless, the stuff I hear all the time, I hear among these people. So here are arguments I've heard, not arguments, but just beliefs I've heard among people who consider themselves secular. Things like, the Bible was written hundreds of years after it was written. All we have are copies of copies of copies of copies. We can't possibly know what the original said.
Oh my gosh.
Even, right, we don't know, right?
We've done episodes on that, by the way. You can,
this sort of casual dismissal of the existence of Jesus. Right. Well, maybe there was a person named Jesus in that area who was seen as a wise guy and a miracle worker. And I'm like, whoa,
right.
Nope. Like that's like saying maybe the earth is round, but you're going to have to prove that to me.
A quick side note. I watched an interview recently with Bart Ehrman. It was no Christians were in the room. It was a totally secular interview. And someone asked Bart Ehrman, he literally said this to Bart Ehrman. They were like, and you take an extreme approach where you say that like, no, I mean like Jesus existed. Yeah. And Bart Ehrman's like, that's not the extreme approach. Yeah. I can't think of any New Testament scholar who denies the existence of Jesus.
That's like calling you a round earth extremist. Yeah, right?
Exactly.
And so the truth, so here's the thing, is having high bias and low awareness of your bias, right, which is secular and anti-supernatural, that any evidence in favor of say the truth of the Bible, right? The truth of the Christian claims, broadly speaking. It's like, well, no, you'll believe anything except that. Not, I'm sorry, I don't mean to like point the finger, but you have an irrational, how do I say this? Less than neutral posture towards the evidence, such that you're willing to believe really unbelievable stuff like maybe Jesus didn't exist. You're willing to believe other less likely stuff in favor of anything that would suggest the truth of Christianity. I'm sorry, there's a really bad way of putting it, but it's something like,
that's okay.
It's like the Christian worldview is true, which depends on Jesus having been real. So maybe he was, and so they believe in this Jesus myth stuff. And there were lots of miracle workers at the time, and you have all of these people, and the exact same story was told about them as it was about Jesus. Well, that's false. Or you have various Jesus mythicists, or you have all these dying and rising gods. There were dying and rising gods and secret religious cults all over the place, and they all told basically the same story. It's like, well, that's false.
Yeah,
but
demonstrably
right. You don't know the evidence, but you're willing. You say that you're neutral. Mm-hmm. Okay, but you're willing to believe without sufficient evidence. You're willing to believe this thing that hasn't been proven to you, right? So he says, "I need proof. I'm not going to believe it until it's proven." And you go, "Okay, well, Jesus was real. You're going to have to show me the proof." And there's this really high bar, but then the same people are happy to believe this stuff. It's just nonsense. They have the dying and rising gods and these mystery cults that all had the same basic story as Christianity, and that Jesus is a retelling of Mithra or Dionysus or who's the other? Bacchus or
Krishna, I've heard as well.
Krishna. Horus is the main one. And Jesus is just a retelling of those things. Well, there's no evidence for that. And there's overwhelming evidence that he existed. But because of your worldview that you think is neutral, you give much more credence to the idea that Jesus is a myth than that he existed. You know what I mean?
Right.
Or like there's an unbelievable thing and a believable thing, and you're preferring the unbelievable thing possibly because you think that you're unbiased. The truth is you have an anti-supernatural, anti-Christian, or anti-religious bias that's causing you to put undue weight on some belief or something like that. Undue weight on this thing that you really shouldn't believe because it's nonsense.
Well, it seems to me that even if they didn't believe it, but put because I think basically any weight is undue weight on Jesus mythicism at least. I mean, it's and I would love to do an episode on this, on Jesus mythicism. That'd be great. Right. We did an episode on myths about Jesus, but not about maybe Jesus
That
didn't
Jesus
exist.
is just a myth. He didn't exist, Right.
But I think putting any weight on that would be undue. But I mean, I do agree that, it's probably because of an underlying bias that comes along with being secular. I want to change gears real quick, unless you had something else you wanted to say about that.
I guess I don't want to say all secular people are biased. That's not what I mean. Yeah. What I mean is
secularism.
The idea that we're going to proceed with my believing in a way where, listen, I'll believe it when you prove it, and you got to prove it through something like the scientific method. That is not neutral. That's not unbiased, and actually relies on maybe sub-rational, or maybe that's what we're getting into, but relies on certain assumptions about the world. And if there's a problem, I think, for a person's the quality of their collection of beliefs, like the quality of their view of the world, if what you think you are is neutral and you don't understand or admit your actual presuppositions. So when you have this disparity between the amount of bias you have and your lack of awareness about that bias, I think that is, I think that has an overall effect on the way that you view the world. And I think that there are a lot of people like that, and who are happy to describe themselves as something like secular or rational or whatever. And they're just they're unaware of their biases, and the stuff that gets into their worldviews is exposes those biases. And so it's not that worldview itself, that secularistic worldview, it's not neutral. But let's talk about, I think you need to be rational about your disbeliefs too. You need to be rational about your doubts. So anyways, I guess there could be lots to say about that.
Well, I mean, let's talk about the alternative a little bit, because it kind of seems like I laid out a few minutes ago, I think it was now it was 7 minutes ago, something like, how, starting from a secular perspective and looking at the evidence is either as biased or not unbiased, the same way if a religious person, starts with God and looks at the evidence, for God, and they're doing the same thing. They both have biases, but I guess the inverse, basically what I'm setting is up, I want to talk about a principle, the principle of credulity. I love it. Because it seems like the secular person can say in response, well, we can't just believe like any old thing and just, we can't just believe like any old thing without evidence or without something like that. So if, let me frame it maybe a little better. So if skepticism is not the neutral, like unbiased approach, I mean, just believing the things you do and going into the search for truth with that, I mean, that's definitely not the unbiased approach. But how can that be related to the principle of credulity? And what is that principle?
Yeah, the principle of credulity was popularized by Richard Swinburne.
Right?
A brilliant thinker. And what I love about him is if you listen to him, he looks like a Harry Potter villain or something. Just the way he sounds, the way he speaks. He's so brilliant and wonderful. But he's advanced this thing called the principle of credulity. And I think he's right. People argue with it, but they've never persuaded me. The principle of credulity is roughly that you're always rational in believing that things are the way they seem to be.
Right.
Unless there's counter evidence. In absence of counter evidence, we'll just say that. You could spend many more paragraphs making a really tight principle. But the principle overall is you ought to believe that things are the way they seem to be unless you have a reason to believe they're not that way.
Right.
And I think that's right. I think that's right. And what that does is it allows us to get around the world. What it does is so there's a presupposition built in. Sure. The presupposition is that my faculties are such that they deliver me more or less reliable information about the world around me. And I think that's true. And I think that the opposite of that, if you said, no, the principle of credulity isn't true, you should not believe that the world is the way that it appears to be unless it's proven, or
which would be like the hyper skeptical position.
It's an unlivable world, and in fact, I think it's an impossible world because there's no way to overcome that kind of skepticism. Because you're saying is the world probably is not the way that it seems to be, but there's no way to understand the world except by it seeming to be a certain way. So if you can never trust, so what Richard Swinburne is saying is always trust the way things seem to be unless you have a good reason to deny it. The opposite would be never trust the way that things seem to be. But the only way that you get the world into you is by it seeming to be a way, right? So you go, I don't know, it seems like this, but it's not, but it must not be like that.
And so it's unlivable.
It's unlivable. And I think the principle would be that you have to believe the world is not the way that it seems to be, which is clearly irrational, right?
Well,
we call those people are... We know that people who are like that, or we can imagine people like that, who they believe the world is completely opposite of the way that it actually is or seems to be. And those are crazy people. Those are people who are deluded or hallucinating or whatever. Like, we recognize that there's something very wrong with them when they think the world is the opposite of the way that it is.
Right. But I mean, and that's because it's unlivable. Because I mean, even secularism, as we've been defining it, is built on the way things seem to be.
Right.
Like,
of course.
it seems to be. Like, I shouldn't believe something unless it's backed up by evidence.
Right.
And that statement is self-refuting. It's self-refuting. And so I want to go back to, like, let's say, like, I guess I think of them as an American. Let's think of a young Baptist kid, grows up in the South, is taught to believe in God, taught to believe the Bible is true, raised as a good Protestant, if you will. So he has pretty strong convictions that, like, God is real. And then he hears from a secular person, okay, well, you need to give me reasons why you think God exists. And the kid's like, well, I guess I never thought about that. So I guess I'll go look for reasons why to think that God exists. I mean, I have a intuition. I have a feeling that God exists based on how I was raised, based on traditions that have been handed down to me. And it seems to have made sense of the world so far. But okay, let me go and formalize some arguments, or go learn some philosophy and learn some arguments. And then you come back and you're like, well, here are reasons I have found to supplement the way that I thought the world seems to have been, seems to be the way that God exists. Yeah. And now I've got more reasons that it seems that way and thinks that way. I firmly believe that process is not immediately irrational or wrong-minded or any more unbiased than a secular approach, just because it didn't start with, okay, now I'm going to disbelieve in God. God doesn't exist, and now I'm going to go do the investigation.
Well, right. So if you approach if two people approach the investigation of whether or not God exists, one believes he does, starts the investigation with, yes, I believe God is real. Then someone else starts the investigation with, I don't believe God is real. I don't think you can say of the second person that he's the unbiased person.
Right.
That is the neutral starting place. It's like, well, nope, you got to start with God. I don't think God does, or it hasn't been proven to me. And then I have to, whatever. It's like, well, no, it's not clear to me that is less biased than the person who already does believe. And you see this come out when you talk to people too. Something like, well, are there any accounts of the resurrection that aren't in the Bible? You go, well, maybe, but or not necessarily this way. Sure. I've heard actually exactly this. Is there anybody who doesn't believe? Are there any atheists or people who don't believe in God who can confirm the resurrection? I'm like, what? Why would that? That seems irrational to me. Right. Somebody believes that Jesus predicted his death and was raised from the dead, but also doesn't follow him or believe that he's not a Christian, or they don't follow him or don't believe that he's divine or something like that. I go, why would you expect that thing? And why would that be preferable? Why would that be preferable? Someone's like, oh yeah, man, he predicted it and he raised from the dead, but whatever. But
speaking of another conversation with Bart Ehrman, he asked that question to a guy, I think his name's Justin Bass. He wrote a book on the resurrection. I thought it's such a weird question. He was like, well, are there any non-Christians who have confirmed the resurrection happened? And I think Justin said either he didn't, or in a reaction video Trent Horn did to it that I watched, and Trent Horn said it. But somebody down the line said, that's a weird question to ask, because believing that the resurrection happened, I mean, just logically follows from that you become a Christian. You're like, no, Jesus rose from the dead. That's what happened to Saul of Tarsus, right? Yeah. Wow, Jesus rose from the dead. I need to stop persecuting Christians and become a Christian myself. And so the fact that, exactly what you said, like, that seems like the height of irrationality to like prove God doesn't exist. I prove that the resurrection happened. Yeah. Well, okay, the resurrection happened, but
is there anybody who believes the resurrection but not in Christianity? And maybe, but I don't understand why that's preferable to somebody who believed it and then was convinced on the basis of the evidence of that thing. It's like, do you know any scientists who are writing in favor of a theory that they don't believe? Well, that'd be weird. Why would that person be an authority? You go, no. Yeah, it seems to me you'd want the scientist who favors a theory and because of the evidence of its truth also believes the theory that they're putting forward, that they're advocating. So it'd be weird, like as though there's a rational preference for somebody advocating the resurrection but also not being religious. Like, that's just weird. I don't. It strikes me as strange, or it strikes me as like, obviously that's not what you want. You know what I mean?
I think so too. I want to ask, maybe we can end with this, unless there was something you wanted to add as well. Can we make a part 2 out of it?
Okay.
So what about the third way, right? So if one way is like going into an investigation with beliefs, the way that things seem to be, and the other way is also going in with beliefs and the way things seem to be, but one is more, no, God doesn't exist, and the one is like, it seems like God does exist.
Yeah, someone could say to us, it doesn't seem to me like there's anything like God.
Yeah, absolutely.
Then you're going to have to give me some counter evidence.
Right. Yeah. No, absolutely. And people do say that. Yeah. And we give it to them. But what about like this third way? And it seems to me right now, like at least like not the most reasonable, but if like you were trying to reach a neutral stance, why can't you just say like, well, I don't know. So I'll go into the investigation not knowing about the truth of the thing I'm investigating. So does that qualify as a neutral stance?
I'd have to think about that some more.
Right.
I'm not sure. I think I think I don't have a good overall like practice, but I think that just being open and honest. And so we tend to be defensive when our biases get shown. So Cam, you're believing this thing because it tends to prove what you want to be true. Okay. But I don't know. I think it's a social phenomenon. There's a reason why it's happening now, right? The 80 years ago, people didn't have the same rational expectations, right? Where they go, well, no, we've moved past that now, and we know that maybe Jesus didn't even exist. It's like, whoa, hey, what? So is there a good third way? I mean, I think, I don't have a great answer. I have a way of thinking about that, but I don't have a great.
Well, I think at least whatever that is, that's not secularism. That third way, that just saying like, I don't know, because it seems like, as we talked about secularism as we've defined it, kind of pulls religion apart from how you live life, how you view the world. It tends to drift to scientistic leanings, atheistic leanings, saying like, yeah, well, I mean, God doesn't exist, or like, I'm not going to believe God does exist, and then go into a exploration of that. At least starting with I don't know, that's not secularism. And so like what we set out to like talk about in this episode is at least, is secularism a neutral stance that people think it is?
Yeah, and I think here's my maybe my main criticism is that secularism, right, by its very nature, what it's doing is closing off the idea of the religious or the sacred, right? It's like, no, we're throwing off those things, and we're adopting a purely rational way of calculating our experience of the world around us, something like that. But secular means like not religious. And so I think my main criticism is that secularism, what it does is it cuts off legitimate ways of knowing and then says you can't know those things. And that's two problems. Like one problem is closing off your mind. It's like throwing tools in the trash and then saying that you can't know those things that can't be caught by my net, right? So I'm mixing metaphors. I'm sorry. I do that. But here's my net, and it can catch everything in the world, and then it can't catch everything in the world. There's plenty of stuff that makes it through, and you either say it's uncatchable. That stuff is uncatchable, and I go, well, you're just using the wrong tool. You know, you need a different net, or you need a plastic bag, or you need There's something else you need to catch that kind of thing. So I think it's a double problem. One is, and in fact, one of my professors put it this way. He was talking about people who call Christians closed-minded. And he goes, that's always been a really interesting charge to me. He goes, because I've always thought my mind is more open, because my mind includes the possibility of a naturalistic explanation and a supernaturalistic explanation. And my mind is open to that entire breadth of possible explanations that it could exist in the purely natural realm or the supernatural realm. But it seems to me that you have a closed mind that says, well, I'm going to stop at the edge of the natural realm, and anything beyond that, I'm not even going to consider as a possible explanation for the thing. And I would say, I think that's right. What we're doing in secularism is closing our mind off to legitimate ways of knowing, and then making the second claim, which is that those other things that are known by other non-scientific means, that they either can't be known, or that they're just a matter of your feelings or your interpretation or your intuition, or that they're not important questions. Right? You ask, why is there something rather than nothing? Maybe you're just asking, how is there something? Well, no, I'm asking why. You want to reduce my metaphysical question to a scientific one, as though the metaphysical question isn't important or interesting, and it is. So just stop doing that. And you, the person who doesn't exist, who I'm making this strong accusation against, this hypothetical interlocutor, is like, no, you are limiting yourself. You are throwing tools in the trash. You're saying all of these other ways of knowing are not ways of knowing, and therefore any of the information that could be gained by using those tools is uninteresting, unknowable, because knowledge only comes through science, and that's self-defeating and blah, 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 blah. So I think that's my main criticism of secularism, is that twofold thing. You are limiting your ways of knowing, and then you're dismissing things that can be known by the other ways of knowing as unimportant or unknowable.
Yeah. Hard to disagree with that.
Well,
but that's just because I'm biased.
You're right. Lots of people will. And okay. But I think it's just important for us to try and understand and challenge our presuppositions and be honest about them. And even when it feels uncomfortable, follow arguments where they go. Like if you get to the end of an argument, you're like, ooh, I don't like this. So therefore, then I reject the premises that are clearly true and rational. I was like, oh, well, I mean, it's what do you know? Dead men can bleed, right?
Well, it's like, ooh, I don't like this. It's like, yeah, I know. That's why I gave you the argument.
Well, that's why we need arguments.
Gave you the argument in the first place.
And I think that's how human knowledge proceeds. And so we disagree and we have arguments, and what we're doing is getting a better and more complete sort of human knowledge, which I think is a really wonderful pursuit.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean we're approaching the end. I think we should wrap it up there. But I'm curious. Oh man, we should talk about sometime soon. A time is coming, and hopefully it will come soon. Got to use those NIV Jesus sayings. Where I'm curious about those other tools. I have thoughts about them, but because I imagine someone would hear what you just said and they're like, yeah, well, what other tools are there besides?
I don't mean a burning in your bosom, but I mean like not all knowledge comes to us through the scientific method.
Right.
Yeah.
Oh gosh, that's exactly where we should leave it. Not all knowledge comes to us through the scientific method, including knowledge about the scientific method, which is absolutely true. Anyways, I like this today. Thank you for talking to me about whether or not secularism is neutral or not.
Yeah.
I have, the glasses are back on. I have changed my mind and secularism is not neutral. Yeah. Anyways, you at home, I hope you found this as interesting as I did, which is going to be very difficult. And we hope we'll see you again next week. God bless.
Thank you for listening to Word First Radio. Be sure to like, subscribe, and check us out online at wordfirst.us.